What time? 9:30. 9:30 for the history hike.
Correct. Meeting on March 7th. Yep. We were just getting ready for a display thing.
Oh, that was my sister-in-law Donna. Oh, I don't know if she still does that. Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, that's a low reset, huh? Yeah.
And years from now, following you.
He's got very rare artifacts. Yeah, they won't. I'll be here nice and I'll be here pretty fun.
You know that because slippery rock.
Nature, history, and some of the things here at Jennings. And the sponsors for today's event include the Butler chapter of the North Country Trail and the Butler Outdoor Club. So without those organizations, we certainly couldn't do that. And the North Country Trail is a national scenic trail that stretches 4,600 miles from North Dakota to Vermont. So including 57 miles, trees, branches, building bridges, repairing washouts, and they also work on trail expansion, working with landowners to fill gap events to an antique gun show and the German Christmas market. So they also have a table inside today, and they're the ones who organize today's history hikes. So if you happen to have already or later decide to go on one of those, Harmony is who you thank for that. My name's Josh, and I work here at Jennings. We're going to be crossing a road, so we got to be careful as we do that. But most importantly, we're going to take this hike across through the prairie and through some of the forest to see different habitats that we have here at Jennings. Time that we don't have access to anymore. So this is what we call a relict prairie. And what sort of tipped us off to this was a flower that we'll talk a little bit more about here in a moment. But does anyone want to guess how the prairie came to be? Does anyone have a guess?
Glaciers.
Yeah, glaciers, right? So now the glaciers didn't come all the way quite to where we are standing, but they were very, very close by. I have a picture here of the area and about where the glaciers came to. So here's the glacier in the lighter color, and there's Slippery Rock, Harrisville, etc. So there was a meltwater, ancient large animals and plants that were here at one time, but we actually only have about 3 to 4 inches of topsoil. So prairie plants traditionally have extremely deep roots. Here they've had to adapt to a shallow, widespread roots. And you'll see there are a few trees that have managed to adapt as well. But we were chatting on the way here, and I mentioned management. So we do actually manage this to maintain it as a prairie, and we'll talk more about that as we get further out into our prairie expansion area. But it's not just a field, right? Some people think, what's the difference between a prairie and a field? Well, the Prairie Bridge. So if you've noticed, we sort of come down a slight hill as we came to this bridge. And if you'll notice, the bridge here, because we're standing over this small creek. Now, the prairie, as I mentioned, is full of all that thick, impermeable clay. So there's only that 3 to 4 inches of topsoil, so that can only absorb so much. There's not as many trees that are soaking up all that water. So it sort of acts like a cookie sheet. When it rains, all the water in the prairie sort of runs down to this area. Now, that's important because our prairie is also home of another resident here that is endangered and sort of unique. Does anyone know what it is? That's right, our eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. So they require a unique habitat, which is the prairie. But they don't need just a prairie. They need upland, dry, sunny areas, such as the prairie, not only to bask and to find their food, but they are a wet hibernator. So Massasaugas actually suspend themselves in water this time of year. So they need access to the water table. So they come down to these lower areas where they can get access to the water table. And they live in a burrow this time of year with everything but their head underwater. So they actually aren't capable of digging down to the water table. Then they get some help from someone here in the prairie. Does anyone know who that might be? Who might dig the hole for the Massasauga?
Is it crayfish?
It is a crayfish, yes. And this has a what we call commensalism relationship with the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. So this digs tunnels and burrows, and you've probably seen the little mud chimneys that they produce, and that's exactly where the Massasauga goes to access the water table. So they do cohabitate with the crayfish. Now, we've talked to some crayfish experts, there is such a thing, and they like to think that that wouldn't really happen. We're in the prairie. This is our prairie expansion area. So Otto Emery Jennings, when he first came here and found that blazing star, he, being a botanist from the Carnegie Museum, he was familiar that that plant was only found further west in tallgrass prairies. So that this must have been a relict prairie, but it didn't look quite like it does today. It had been grown in on itself quite a bit. So some work was done to remove some of those trees and larger woodier stem species to allow some of the prairie species to maintain and establish themselves once again. So this area, we are building on that same type of research. This is what you could think of as somewhat of a savanna style habitat with the taller trees and then the grasslands underneath it. But we are starting to see Massasaugas move into this area and the crayfish as well. So it is proving to his point that if you make sure that that prairie is maintained, that these species will also be able to maintain themselves. So we have expanded this area, and a little bit further up ahead, just to maybe figure out what that is, I'm not sure. That's our fun find so far. Interesting. But I do want you to think about, as we start to continue our hike around this corner, we're going to be entering a new environment and things are going to start to change compared to where we've been. So just think about the differences that you feel, see, hear, etc. So we are going to be heading into the forest now and talk about some of the things that we can enjoy this time of year in the forest. See what we like to call the bones of the land. You can sort of look around now that all the leaves are off the trees, and even the snow seems to help you make out the definitions of different little dips and valleys and hills in the landscape. So this is a good time of year, and I like this spot especially because you can see a lot of that. And we have these two drainages on the sides of us that maybe you'd overlook if you were hiking by another time of year, but the winter really seems to be a good time of year to get a good look at this landscape. And I want you to think about how when the settlers first arrived to this area, Pennsylvania was covered in much denser forest than we have today. So the average tree was between 5 and 6 feet in diameter. And an area like the prairie was a very well welcomed open area that they could relax, enjoy the sunshine, let their animals graze, right? It was very nice compared to these dark, dense forests. Like if you were to think of something like Cook Forest State Park, if you've been there, that would be what the forest in the vast majority of Pennsylvania looked like at the time. So very dark. So now that we're in the woods and they started to have these open areas, started to settle down, they were clearing areas of land. So there you can sometimes see evidence of a tree that was around in a large open area by itself. So there's one good example over here to the left of us and another one a little bit further, but if you were to look up towards the top of this tree, it's branching in every possible direction. So this is what we refer to as a wolf tree, and there's another example that we'll pass here shortly. But that tree was able to sprawl in every direction as the area around it was totally cleared. So these large trees were left behind intentionally to create areas of shade for the animals and themselves. And then also it was able to allow like more sensitive plant species over time to live underneath them in those wetter shaded areas. And then that helps again with that succession that we were talking about. So you can sort of see some of the history of the land this time of the year when looking for things like a wolf tree. And in this area, something that our forest has been subjected to is the emerald ash borer. Ash trees were once quite prevalent in the area, but the insect came through and unfortunately has caused quite a bit of damage. So there's very few ash trees left in Pennsylvania, but that's a good example of a disturbance, like many of the types of disturbance that we recreate through our techniques, and that therefore then caused all those trees to die and become a source or a host of many other things such as insects, but unfortunately to the cost of the ash tree. So that's not so wonderful in that regard. But deer and disease and invasives, all things like that can affect our forest and change them over time. And so the wolf tree is just one way I like to remember the different types of changes that Jennings has gone through, because this land hasn't always looked like this. And stay tuned here, I'll point out that other wolf tree as we pass it. But the next area we're going to be going into as we start to leave the forest is an area that one animal's strategies for survival totally changed the landscape and provided habitat for even more. So I'll leave you with that as we walk. But any questions about the forest? A short 15 years ago, this looked no different than the last 5-10 minutes of our hike. This was a forested valley. Can anyone take a guess at what animal might have changed this environment?
Beaver.
That's exactly right. This is our beaver wetland. So beaver are referred to as ecosystem engineers. They are the only animal that create their own habitat, and in that they then create habitat for many other species as well. So this area never used to look like this. You can see the remnants of some of the trees that were still here, and it's been a bit of a battle with our beavers. At the moment, there are no beavers here. Recently, we were overrun with beavers. So part of management, this trail wouldn't have been walkable. We would have been under 2 foot of water. I have videos of it. It's quite insane how flooded this area was. So it was a constant battle between us, the beavers, and the trail. And so it'd get washed away. We'd put a whole project in, all new trail, gone. So they had been trapped out. But it's sort of a balance. It's never going to be a permanent thing. They will always be coming back, and we will allow them to be here as long as possible. And we did try to manage like a small population, but it was too much and they did have to be removed. But they certainly will find their way back in here again. And the more time you spend in this area, you can still see sign of them. If you sort of look behind us here along the trail and further up the trail, you see beaver chewed logs, where they were chewing down the trees and building their dams. So we not only have a beaver dam, but 2 lodges, an old one and then the one they were currently using. So today we'll be going back up the hill, but if you were to continue on this trail through the beaver wetlands, you can see sign of that. And maybe one day you'll be lucky enough to see the beavers themselves, but they are quite elusive, even when there was a thriving family of them here. So this area is an example of how beavers can change that. And can anyone think of the other animals that they might be creating habitat for when they flood an area?
Muskrat.
Absolutely, muskrat, mink, etc., fish, right? And all sorts of different reptiles and amphibians that are going to use that flooded area. So we are welcoming this sort of change to this area over the last 2 decades. But that's not to say it's not without some headaches at times. We've tried to coexist with the beavers, like install pipes that allow the water to flow through the dam, but as you know, that's not what they like. So that was a bit of a battle. Some of the animals that they help. So we have this here, and then here's our beaver itself, no tail. But we do have some furs here, so if you want to take a look at these, pass them around. All right, so there's one more cool environment that I want to chat with you about before we end our hike today. It is 12:05, so if anyone does need to go, this is our last stop. We're only about a 5-minute walk from the center. But the last thing I'd like to chat about with you is what's right in front of us. Does anyone know what we're looking at here?
Vernal pool?
Pavilion.
Yes, a picnic pavilion, yes. Lovely for eating. But between there and there, as you mentioned, yes, this is what is called a vernal pool. So a vernal pool isn't just any old puddle in the woods. It does have some specific characteristics that define it as a vernal pool. But what one of those is it sort of has a seasonality to it. So oftentimes it will be dry throughout the year and then hold water for a portion of the year. So this will do exactly that, this sort of depression here that the snow can sort of help you make out. And there's very specific plant and animal species that we find in vernal pools that we call indicator species that help do just that, indicate that this is properly a vernal pool. So some of those species are wood frog, fairy shrimps, salamanders, eastern spadefoot toads, and clam shrimp. So these pools serve as a nursery or a breeding ground for a large number of amphibians and reptiles and insects and many plant species that are of concern here in PA, such as small beggar ticks, lance-leaved loosestrife, oaks pondweed, spotted pondweed, and northeastern bulrush, which is a federally endangered plant found almost exclusively in Pennsylvania vernal pools. So these help as well, like the beaver wetlands, with flood control and help recharge groundwater and purify water as well. But one of the things that we like the most about our vernal pools is that we find all those frogs in them. So if you'll humor me here, I have a little silly device that'll make some of those frog noises. So I'll play a few of them for us, because this is the sounds you could expect another time of the year to be hearing here at the vernal pool. So it's a bit quiet, but that was a upland chorus frog. We'll do one that you're probably familiar with. A bullfrog, yeah. And then here is one of our favorites. That would be our spring peepers.